Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Research Tuesdays event, Compulsory Voting, Strengthening Democracy. My name is Nick Drevis and I'm the Marketing Manager, Research and Innovation here at the University of Adelaide. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace,
Good evening, everyone,
and welcome to tonight's
Roseworthy
Research Tuesdays event. Compulsory
After the
voting,
postponement of the
April
democracy.
Research Tuesdays event,
My name is Nick
due to
Drevis, and I'm the
COVID-19,
Marketing Manager,
we are
Research
delighted to
and
bring you
Innovation
tonight's
here
event
at the
as a live
University of
webinar.
Adelaide.
Tonight we focus
Firstly,
on
I'd like to
compulsory voting
acknowledge and pay our
strengthening
respects
democracy.
to the Kaurna people, the original
Our first speaker
custodians
tonight will
of
be
the Adelaide
Professor
Plains.
Lisa Hill. Before taking up her position as Professor of Politics at the University of Adelaide in 2008, Lisa was a 5-year Australian Research Council Fellow at the University of Adelaide, a 5-year Fellow in Political Science at the Australian National University, and lectured in Politics and Political Theory at the University of Sydney. Lisa's areas of interest are electoral law, electoral behaviour, political theory, history of political thought, and political corruption. Our second speaker tonight will be Professor Adam Gravcar, who is Professor of Public Policy and the Director of the Stratton Institute here at the University of Adelaide. Adam has had careers in both academia and government, having acquired extensive policy experience over 22 years in various senior level posts. He has held both in the Commonwealth and in South Australian governments. He has also worked extensively with global agencies such as United Nations and World Bank. Adam has 2 doctorates from the University of New South Wales and is the author of some 250 publications, a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and a member of the Order of Australia. Each presenter tonight will speak for approximately 20 minutes, and there will be opportunity to field some real-time questions at the end of tonight's presentation via the webinar platform appearing on your screens. I would now like to invite Professor Lisa Hill to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks for that lovely introduction, Nick. So today I'm going to be talking about one of my research areas, which is compulsory voting, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history, a little bit about the effects, but mainly what we want to focus on tonight is the way in which it strengthens democracy. And it does strengthen democracy. As far as I can tell, and I've checked everything, and I'm pretty sure it does. I'm with Politics and International Relations here at the University of Adelaide, but I'm also in the Stratton Institute for Public Policy, of which Adam is the Chief Professor and Director. So, Marion Saw, who's a very well-known Australian political scientist, once described Australia as the first nation created not by revolution, but from the ballot box. And she was referring to all the referenda we had to bring Australia into existence. And so I feel that Australia is a culture that's actually quite electorally focused, ballot box focused, and democracy focused, actually. Our democracy has also been marked by a lot of innovation. So we've never been frightened of trying new things. And compulsory voting is considered to be a very strange and unusual thing to most people in voluntary settings. But it's something we've always lived with, and it's probably our most important innovation, and yet strangely our less imitated innovation. Other nations seem to be very cautious and scared about adopting it, but they shouldn't. It's not scary, it's quite nice. Now, we actually weren't the first nation to use compulsory voting, though we'd like people to think that. Switzerland and Belgium got there first. There's only compulsory in a couple of Swiss cantons. It's still compulsory in Belgium. But we're the only English-speaking country to use it and one of the few advanced democracies that use it. We're also a great example of a successful regime that is constantly experimenting with improvements. So we introduced compulsory voting so that we could maximise electoral inclusion, and we keep experimenting all the time to refine the system, to improve its inclusivity, but also to improve its integrity, which is very important in our system. It's very important that if you're making everybody vote, that the system functions very well and with high levels of integrity, so that people trust the outcome of the election and also feel that it was worth their while to go out and vote. Some countries are now thinking about legislating to introduce compulsory voting because of the democratic crises we're having worldwide and civic demobilisation we're having worldwide. Right now, Vanuatu and Samoa are working on introducing it. They're doing it to combat the problem of female underrepresentation and corruption, and they're likely to that is likely to be a successful solution to both those problems. Now, compulsory voting exists where the state imposes a legal requirement to vote. The term is a little bit misleading though, because it doesn't involve the requirement to mark the ballot formally. So you're not actually being asked to vote. What you're asked to do is to turn up, have your name ticked off the roll and put a ballot in the ballot box. So it's really only attendance at a polling place that's legally required. You can put in a blank ballot or a vote that's informal in another way. You can mark it, you can protest on it if you like. And believe it or not, anything you put in there is recorded by the Electoral Commission. Not your name obviously isn't attached to it, but they're interested in the kind of material that people are writing on their ballots. And also I'm very interested, and so am I interested in the rate of blank ballots. It's actually telling me something about what's going on out there. So it's only attendance. The Netherlanders even had a word for that when they had compulsory voting or compulsory attendance up until the 1970s, well 1970 really, and that was called omkomsplit. It just meant you're only required to attend. We're not saying you have to vote, and you don't have to vote. But personally I think it's better if you do vote. We had compulsory registration in 1911, then we didn't get it at the federal level to have mandatory voting until 1924. If you want to have look at some historical background as to the lead up of compulsory voting and the introduction of that law, Judith Brett has recently written a very nice book about it. And there I've got a picture of some Australian punters relaxing with their towels and about to vote. Nobody seems stressed out is the reason I put that slide up there, and I'll show you some more Australians in their relaxing wear and voting in a minute. Now, aside from regularising the electoral roll, compulsory voting was introduced to address the problem of low voter turnout. Now, I think it's quite funny that we thought our low turnout was scandalously low at 58.7%, which is what is usually in most established democracies. But we didn't think it was good enough, so we introduced it, and then it was an extremely effective and decisive remedy. It worked straight away like that, and then it stayed like that all along. So in electoral studies, they're grateful, people in electoral studies are grateful if something they introduce gets turnout to rise by 3 percentage points or 7. To get that amount of a surge is pretty impressive, over 30%. And it's been able to keep us there in that range ever since. While in other established democracies, turnout's declining, ours has remained steady. So some of the questions I'll be looking at today, some I'll be paying more attention to than others. Under what conditions might it be appropriate to compel people to vote? And I'll just quickly flick through that and you can go back over the slides if you're interested. Why is compulsory voting so well tolerated here? You may or may not know that Australians are actually perfectly happy with their arrangements, and they've stayed that way for decades. About 30% don't like it and about 70% do like it. No matter what's going on out there, that is basically the breakup of the figures. Some people say, well, compulsory voting does nothing more than raise turnout. I'm going to explain that it does more than raise turnout, but I also want to point out that what's wrong with raising turnout? It's not a bad thing. It's not just a question of numbers. Some people say that compulsory voting makes citizens more apathetic. I'm going to look at that question. Some people say it makes government less effective. I'm also going to look at that question. God, I'm running out of time already. I better go fast. And the last question to look at is whether compulsory voting is a violation of democratic values or whether it can actually enhance some democratic values. So I won't dwell on this very much, but I just want to point out that compulsory voting is not appropriate for every setting. You have to have, you already have to have a good infrastructure for this to work well and a high level of trust in the electoral arrangements. You can't have it in a one-party state where it might be used to forge consent or legitimise one-party contests. It wouldn't be appropriate. You have to have a well-established system of democratic institutions with proper civil and political rights, so it can't be dangerous to vote. And of course, you should have universal suffrage. You should have free, competitive and fair elections. You should have the proper apparatus of constitutionalism, limits on political powers, and all those other things that go to what I call an authentic democracy. You would have to have a nice national infrastructure for it to be appropriate, which we do have. reasonable levels of cooperation between the regional and central governments, which we do have, and you'd have to have professional, well-funded, independent and accountable electoral officers, which we do have. The reason we have those conditions is partly because we had compulsory voting. When we introduced compulsory voting, we decided, well, we better make sure this system works well. If we're going to get everyone voting, we better have properly funded electoral commissions. So we're one of the first places in the world to professionalise our electoral commissions, and we do have a very good system. You also need to make sure that there are few opportunity and transaction costs to voters, meaning it shouldn't be burdensome. If you're going to make people do something in a democracy, particularly something that everyone thinks of as a voluntary type of activity, make sure it's not hard. That means you shouldn't have to go very far. It shouldn't have to cost you money to travel somewhere. You shouldn't have to forego other enjoyable activities in order to vote. You shouldn't have to have an election on a Tuesday where you have to leave work and maybe miss out on earning power. If you live in the outback, there should be a polling booth readily available, which there is here. There's almost no transaction or opportunity cost to voters in this country. Now, the reason I put pictures of Australians half naked in their bathing gear is because they are not foregoing an enjoyable activity like a day at the beach or the pool in order to vote. There's plenty of spaces there. They know they're not going to be standing around naked for too long because they'll be in and out. There'll be enough ballot papers, there won't be a long queue, and there'll be plenty of booths there for them. So they're going to the pool or on their way back from the pool. It's also preferable if there's a degree of genuine choice in the political offer. You can't herd everyone in to vote and then have no decent choice among the candidates. That makes voters angry. We know in some settings where it's compulsory, voters will return a lot of blank ballots if the political offer is unsatisfactory. If you have PR, proportional representation and preferential voting, that's going to expand automatically choice. First past the post depresses choice, but we've got that stuff, PR and preferential. Public acceptance is very important. So you have to make the experience meaningful for people, and there has to be real choice. Now, some people say that compulsory voting does nothing more than raise turnout. So one of my interlocutors, so I'm involved in paper wars at all times with people that think compulsory voting is a terrible idea. And they'll say, oh, well, it just raises turnout. But before I talk about what else it does, I'd just like to pause to point out that raising turnout is not nothing. Having high turnout is great. Surely that's better than low turnout. My interlocutors say, well, they're just numbers, who cares? They're not just numbers, I do care. And I'll come back to this in a minute, how the composition of the electorate changes when turnout's high. Now, other folks say there are less coercive ways to raise turnout. And of course, if we want to do something, it's much better to have a non-coercive way of doing it than a coercive way. Obviously, nobody likes coercion. I don't either. So they say do Saturday voting, absentee voting, lowering the voting age, PR, offer incentives to vote, improve registration, put voting booths in malls, etc., online voting. But even if you've got all the different ideas about how to raise turnout and put them all together, you still wouldn't be able to have the same turnout raising power as compulsory voting. All those things together would still not give you turnout in the 90% range. Also, we added all that stuff as well. We do most of that stuff except for offering incentives to vote. We have all that stuff just to top it off, just so there's no chance that we're not maximising inclusion. Good on you, Australia. We actually do a very good job here. So compulsory voting is very effective at raising turnout. It can do it from a minimum of 12 to a maximum of 30 percentage points. But usually now the magic number is 30. Chile, when it got rid of compulsory voting, turnout immediately plummeted by 30 percentage points, and it stayed down there. It's the only institutional mechanism that can achieve turnout rates of 90% and above on its own. Further, its effect on turnout is immediate and lasting. So you don't just get a spike, it obviously continues. You don't have to wait for it to kick in, like with electoral education. Let's educate people to like voting more. That might work, but you might be waiting for decades for that to work. Compulsory voting works straight away. And further, I don't have to have a fancy theory of why people don't vote for my suggestion to work. So I might say, well, if people learn more about how wonderful voting is and how effective their vote can be, they'll be more likely to vote, and then they try electoral education, it doesn't work, we try something else. No one 100% knows why people don't vote. And so let's just cut to the chase and get them to vote. And so that's what compulsory voting does. We don't 100% know why they don't voting. I've got a few ideas, but the best way to get them voting is to have compulsory voting. It just works. So it's had a positive effect here in terms of raising turnout and expanding the franchise. Now that's really important, the number and range of people who vote. So it's not just raise the number of people who vote, the kinds of people that vote. And that happens in any system where it's administered properly and with proper sanctions. So you've got to have a little sanction for it to work, but that's kind of symbolic. $20 is not a lot for failure to vote. The thing is, in Australia, voting is so easy that it's easier to vote than it is not to vote. It's more trouble to have to write a letter to the AEC and say, or your local electoral commissioner, why you didn't vote, than to vote. Now, Australians don't mind. Around 70% for decades have said they like it. And a vast majority of Australians comply with the laws. And in a recent large-scale study, when asked what they like most about their democracy, most Australians agreed that Australian elections are free and fair. So they're well run and they're free. They thought it was a pretty good system. And it's even risen in recent years, while everyone else in the world is running for the hills, away from their ballot box. Why are Australians so accepting of CV? Well, first of all, voting is so easy here. The state handles most of the opportunity and transaction costs. It's made sure it's on a Saturday. It's made sure that the voting polling places are numerous and everywhere. There's postal voting, there's absent voting, there's declaration voting, any kind of voting. There's silent voting if you're worried about your name being on the electoral roll and someone being able to find out where you live. If you're more than 8 kilometres away from a polling place, you don't have to vote. So it's a pretty user-friendly system. Also, the penalties are applied consistently but without zealotry. The Electoral Commission always follows up, but it doesn't get nasty. If you write a letter saying, oh, I wasn't well that day or my car broke down, they'll say that's fine. And it's only a $20 fine at the federal level. There's also a high degree of trust in our electoral process. Because it's so well run, and it's well run because we had compulsory voting, so then we had very high levels of electoral integrity and electoral management. There's a high degree of trust in the electoral process. At the end of every election, a lot of people might complain about the outcome, meaning my party didn't win, but nobody in Australia goes around saying that wasn't a fair fight. Nobody goes around saying something went wrong there. So our electoral officers are very well organised and they run very well. So Australians have great faith in the mechanics of their electoral process. Therefore, the accuracy and procedural legitimacy of outcomes are rarely, if ever, disputed. Also, Australians report being happy with the amount of choice they have on their ballot paper. They say, well, I felt I had a good choice and there were differences between the candidates. It wasn't really Tweedledum and Tweedledee. The other interesting thing about Australia is, and I think we're seeing that now with COVID-19, is Australians place more value than almost anyone in the world on obeying the law. Now, we like to think of ourselves as larrikins and kind of naughty people. We are naughty people. We do like to have a lot of fun and to sometimes push the envelope. But when it comes to the law, I feel that Australians feel themselves that they have signed the social contract and therefore, and that their government is also more responsive to them when they don't like something because they vote. So they feel invested in the laws and they feel that we should all obey them. So this is why we've had the high level of compliance in Australia compared to a lot of other settings with the government request to stay at home. Australians also tend to see voting more as a duty than a right than people in other places. They thought the most important thing about being a good citizen was always voting in elections. In other settings, they didn't rate that the number one thing, but Australians said, yeah, you've got to vote. Come on, we've all got to do it, so what's the problem? And Australians therefore seem to regard the imposition to vote as an acceptable imposition on their individual autonomy. But some people see compulsory voting as antithetical to democratic ideals and an unnecessary imposition on personal autonomy. So some people in Australia and some people from outside Australia that don't like our compulsory voting system. And they say, so what if it raises turnout? Low turnout's nothing to worry about. And they even say it could be a good thing. Annabelle Lever, for example, says that people in voluntary systems abstain because they're satisfied with the status quo and happy to go along with what others decide. So in voluntary systems, they're not voting not because they're unhappy, but because they're happy, but they're actually happy with the system, so they don't feel they need to vote to complain about it. So that she says they're conferring tacit consent. So when I read that, no, there was no study on this, so I went and found any study I could find on the attitudes of non-voters in voluntary systems in established democracies, and I found out that they're far less satisfied with democracy than are habitual voters. It's not a sign of tacit consent at all. It's a sign of absolute contempt and walking away feeling kind of political despair. Another of my interlocutors says that a country with universal suffrage and high levels of turnout is not more democratic than one with similarly universal suffrage and lower levels of turnout. In other words, as long as everyone's legally allowed to vote, what's the problem if they choose not to? And that these low turnout elections are no less legitimate than high turnout elections. So that's a good question, isn't it? Do these turnout levels make any difference? As long as you're legally allowed to vote, and if you choose not to vote, well, fine, if nothing's stopping you. But then my question becomes, how low is too low before I get your attention? 50%? 40%? 15%, as you get in some gubernatorial elections in America? 15. Isn't anybody worried now? Are they still even calling this a democracy? If nobody votes but everyone is legally allowed to vote, are we still going to call it a democracy? And I would say, I don't think so. Something's really up with that. Also, just the quality rather than quantity of voter information changed. So first of all, you're getting more information from voters about what they want, even if it's exactly the same, if everyone would vote exactly the same, but 90% of voting versus 50%, but it was the same outcome. Still, it's good to be able to say, well, we checked, and that's what you wanted, good. Secondly, does the quality of the input change? Yes. The quality of, or the type of votes that come into the system when turnout's high changes, because when turnout's high, more diverse inputs are captured. Now, it's an ironclad rule just about in electoral studies. Low turnout means low and socially uneven turnout. Turnout will be concentrated among the prosperous, among the white, among well-established citizens, among the highly educated and people who own homes. And failure to vote will be concentrated among everyone from marginal groups. This in turn, but when you get compulsory voting, all these people that normally vote suddenly are voting. This causes representatives to behave differently. When everybody votes, especially when the poor and marginalised are voting, representatives have to behave differently. This is because of the old truisms. Truism that if you don't vote, you don't count. And if you do vote, you do count. Politicians pay attention to voters. I don't know why my interlocutors don't concede that point, but everybody knows that attentive publics, which are voters, enjoy the attentions of politicians. Now, according to Jason Brennan, who's my #1 interlocutor, in fact, we wrote a book together, a for and against book. When I say together, he wrote his half and I wrote my half. He says that compulsory voting changes the quality of the electorate. Under voluntary voting, the median and typical voter is less better informed, less biased. It's like a magic wand that makes the electorate dumber about politics. This is a quote, this is not me. Government tends to give the people what they want. Thus, compulsory voting should produce somewhat lower quality and more incompetent government. Now, I've highlighted that word should because when I read that quote, I thought I gotcha, because you didn't check, Jason. So I thought, well, I'll go and check as best I can. It's not easy to do it, but I did go and check and looked at some applied studies. Are governments worse and voters dumber under CV? That's his word, not mine. I would use the word less sophisticated. No, governments are probably not worse under compulsory voting. For a start, governments in compulsory voting regimes are less corrupt. There's less political corruption in these settings. We already know governments must be better. Bad governments are corrupt, good governments are not corrupt. That is a well-known fact. Secondly, compulsory voting regimes have less income inequality because they're not just representing well-off voters. So governments are more representative of the entire population, not just the privileged sections, and they're more responsive. So they're also less corrupt in the broad Aristotelian sense that the government is supposed to represent everybody. Because turnout is more socially diverse, it makes governments more representative of the people as a whole. They're more attentive to voting groups, and now that everyone's voting, they have to be attentive to everybody. And so governments are not supposed to just vote to serve the interests of those who voted, and they're not just supposed to serve the interests of those who voted for them. They're supposed to represent everyone's interests. So instead of just helping those who are already better off, which is what you get in a voluntary system, they're helping everybody. And there's no shortage of studies that prove that. If you want to check my book that I wrote with Jason Brennan, you can see all the millions of studies that show that. If you get a constituency voting, suddenly they get government attention. Compulsory voting is also correlated with high levels of satisfaction with democracy, both in Australia and elsewhere. Now, some people are claiming that we're getting declining levels of satisfaction and trust in government. That's a blip. We've had levels that low before. But something we do know actually for sure that it's not declining is that Australians have very high levels of faith in the mechanics of their electoral process. Also, citizens in compulsory voting regimes are not politically dumber. This has actually been proved empirically in 3 studies that were carried out on citizens in voluntary regimes versus citizens in mandatory regimes. And the citizens in the mandatory regimes are more attentive to the behaviour of governments. They're more politically sophisticated and knowledgeable than people in voluntary regimes. This is because they know they have to vote, so they start paying a little bit more attention. And finally, I just want to address this point about compulsory voting violating personal autonomy. Does compulsory voting violate personal autonomy? Of course it does. Anything the government makes you do, being made to send my son to school is a violation of autonomy, or pay taxes. The question is whether it's a justified violation of my autonomy. Being made to send my son to school is actually justified, so is paying taxes. Otherwise, how can I ride on the roads, and how can I have the kind of amenities I have in this society? How can I have law and order? So is it a justified violation of my autonomy? We compel citizens to do things all the time. Now, compared to having to pay tax or sit on a jury or send my son to school, which are all solutions to collective action problems, compulsory voting actually imposes a very minor infringement on my personal rights, because it takes up so little of my time and energy and costs me virtually nothing. And the autonomy objection, so the autonomy objection can still be there, even if I can explain what's great about compulsory voting, because my adversary might say, well, but I value autonomy so highly that none of the good things you tell me about it can make me accept that compulsory voting's a reasonable imposition. But if I can convince my adversary that what I get in exchange for giving up my right for the choice to abstain, which incidentally is not a real right, no court has ever recognised it, but say there was such a right, I might be able to convince him. If I could explain to that person that you get a more legitimate government in the eyes of political theorists, but also in the eyes of the population. You get a more representative government, you get more political equality, so you really start to realise the value of one vote, one value. Everyone's vote counts now. You get more inclusiveness, you minimise elite power, you get less corruption, and you get more responsive government. So I think it's a pretty good deal for that minor imposition on this so-called right to abstain. And I think I better stop there, because now we're going to hear from Adam about what happens after everybody's voted.
Well, thank you very much for that, Lisa. That was really informative, and it was interesting, and it laid out a whole lot of challenges. And there are 2 challenges in that talk that I want to pick up a bit more on now. One is about governments being more responsive when there's compulsory voting, and the other as being less corrupt. And what I want to talk about really is a sort of integrity envelope, of which compulsory voting is one part. Now, you vote. After the vote, what happens next? You know, how does government work? Where does it all come? And what makes it work as well as it should? And sometimes we say it doesn't work all that well. In fact, there's an old saying that says, if you love sausage and have a respect for the law, you should never watch either of them being made. Anyway, you know, the key issue that we have is that we have robust processes and an impartial public service, and that's a very important part. And while not all politicians think that the public service might be impartial, we see a continuity, but in recent decades we've had situations where politicians have fired department heads when they've come into government figuring that the trust isn't there. But when we look at the whole electoral process, what happens is that during the election, the government goes into caretaker mode, and no policy decisions are taken in that process. You know, a committee of public servants basically makes the day-to-day decisions and consults with ministers, but they're not about policy things, they're about the routine things that happen in government. And there's also, with the public servants, a management of election issues. There's the proroguing of Parliament, there's the arrangement of issuing writs, etc. And also, while the election is being held, the public servants are very busy writing incoming government briefs. One for each side, a red book and a blue book. I've forgotten which colour is which at this stage. And there are two components of these incoming government briefs. One talks about the state of play in the department and the issues that are looming, and the other component is how the election promises of the various parties are going to be implemented. It's not up to the public servants to say whether they're good or bad ideas. It's up to the public servants to say, well, this is what you've promised and this is how it's going to be put into practice. Sometimes with difficulty, sometimes with ease, but nevertheless it's an integrity issue of impartiality. And after the election, there are machinery of government issues. There are advice that usually comes from the Cabinet Office about how the machinery of government processes might work, what the portfolios of the ministers, the politicians decide this, but there's the swearing in, there's the recalling of Parliament, there's the preparation of the governor's speech. All of this is a process that is part of the integrity envelope. And in the Cabinet Office, for example, which is an essential but non-partisan part of government, there's a whole processing of the decision-making process. It's the administrative hub for cabinet meetings. It coordinates the Executive Council, which actually puts into law, signs into law the things that the legislature passes. It provides support for cabinet and cabinet committees. It monitors compliance with cabinet processes against agreed cabinet procedures. It monitors cabinet decisions to make sure that they've all been put into place. And all of this is part of the integrity of governance along with compulsory voting. They're segmented in different ways, but they come together as a whole. And government's responsive, as Lisa said, it's responsive not only because people have voted compulsorily, but because there are established processes, a registration process, a voting process, an orderly proroguement of Parliament, a coming together afterwards, advice for ministers and governments from public servants about the machinery issues of government and how the things that people have voted on can be put into effect. And of course, look, politics is a tough game. Politicians aren't always responsive to every whim, every wish in the community. People often wish they were responsive to every whim and every wish. Politicians play politics hard, crossbenchers play it even harder because very often they hold a balance of power. But let me talk a bit more about integrity, because we can start to look at some of the contrasts. Lisa talked about the small number of countries that have compulsory voting, and I don't want to start comparing us with countries like Somalia or Afghanistan or Sierra Leone or somewhere like that where there are huge gulfs. But if we compare for a moment with the bastion of democracy, the shining light of our democratic history, the United States, though Lisa made some comments saying that she didn't think the United States was as democratic as it might be. But voter turnout's very, very small, about half of what we've got, and the less the voter turnout, the more in the United States that the democracy is diminished. And there are many reasons for this diminution, and I think nobody would say that the circus we've got in the United States at the moment reflects at all well on democracy or could in any way be called a solid administrative success. You know, but it's interesting. I lived in the United States for a few years. I worked with people in government. I worked as an academic, but we had close links with government. And I'm now here a professor of public policy at the University of Adelaide. And I say so often, look, we've got nothing to learn from the United States about public policy, and even less to learn about democratic processes. And it's important to do the contrast to understand the integrity envelope. There are two things about elections in general, and they are highlighted and contrasted between, say, the United States and Australia. First, in the United States, elections can easily be bought, often with impunity. It's very much a winner-take-all situation. Whoever wins it then feels that they have a mandate to go down a particular path. They can't always put stuff into process, and I might come back to some of that. So elections on the one hand can be bought, and on the other hand, in contrast to our system, the public service in the United States is very weak. It's very process-oriented, but when we get to policy levels in the public service in the United States, there's essentially a ceiling, and people above the basic executive level of government are all political appointees. After each election, they all hand in their resignations, all the executive officers, all of the ambassadors, numerous people, and it takes almost half a term to get them back into place, and you get elected, or you get put into these positions very largely if you're a big donor, if you say the right things, if you're regarded as a safe pair of hands. But it's interesting also to look at the way in which elections can be bought, and perhaps to contrast a little. In the United States, the 15th Amendment made voting, it said the voting could not be a bridge, the right to vote could not be a bridge on the basis of class, colour, or race, colour, or previous conditions of servitude. And yet people of colour are not in a position to buy elections. But in 2010, the Supreme Court in the United States, in a judgment known as Citizens United, essentially abolished the cap on corporations' donations to political parties. It was a 5-4 decision, but what it meant was anybody or any corporation could have no limit on the amount of donations they could give. They could not only buy elections, but they could buy specific policies. They could buy specific programs. They could buy specific access. And the argument in this was a First Amendment right, and this was about freedom of speech, and money was like speech. So money buys speech, buys power, and so on. But in contrast, in 2016 in New South Wales, the State Electoral Commission withheld public funding to the Liberal Party for not disclosing political donors that had given money in the previous election. And then the New South Wales Parliament had also passed legislation saying that property developers were not permitted to make donations to political parties. And this went to the High Court in a case called McCloy's case. And the High Court confirmed the ban on property developers making donations. So we've got this very distinct contrast that helps shape our voting situation. And in the United States, without compulsory voting, elections can easily be stolen. And we've seen that again and again. And there are two basic ways of stealing elections. One by voter suppression, and the other by hacking. And both of these processes, voter suppression and hacking, weaken the integrity of elections. And when the integrity of elections is weakened, then the ability of government to do what people want the government to do, or what people vote for the government to do, is similarly weakened. Now, the hacking issue is an interesting one because there's a move to online voting, electronic voting, and what's happened in the United States is that the technology is not very good. It's not very good in many areas, but the voting area, and in fact, America, having lived there, I was always surprised at how poor the level of technology for average people was in terms of things like banking and phones and so on. But in the voting area, they bought, by and large, poor quality machines. The experts said, look, these machines aren't real good, they're easily hackable. We saw that in the 2016 election. The experts kept saying there were no checks, there were no way of making sure. And in the state of Florida in 2018, there were 127,000 votes that went missing. There was no trace of them. They just went missing. They went missing. No trace, no footprint, no receipts, no nothing. And all of these were in areas, in precincts that had black majorities. And some of you might remember, going back to the year 2000, Florida again had the whole issue of the hanging chads, which then determined the outcome of the 2000 presidential election. So you've got a technological glitch, 127,000 votes go missing and nobody gives a toss. Compare that to Western Australia, or the Commonwealth in the 2016 Senate election. Some votes went missing. I've forgotten how many. It was a ballot box or a couple of boxes. Anyway, the votes went missing. But the Australian Electoral Commission then decided to rerun the whole election, to rerun the Senate election for Western Australia. Huge cost, huge inconvenience, huge disruption, but nevertheless, this was the way it worked, and this was the reflection on integrity in that process. So as we then move towards the 2020 election, there'll be, in the United States, there'll be a huge focus on voter suppression. This is a big issue because following the 15th Amendment in 1870, which gave people of colour the right to vote, there have been systematic approaches in recent years, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years since the 2013 decision of the Supreme Court to essentially trash the Voting Rights Act. And this again comes back to what happened in 2008. Something like 5 million more minority voters voted than had ever voted before, and they voted for a black president. And a lot of people didn't like that. And they've been working to make sure it doesn't happen again. And blacks and immigrants are targeted. At one point, Lisa talked about polling booths being accessible. Since 2012, 1,688 polling booths have been closed in the United States. And voting is almost invariably on a Tuesday, so you've got to give up work, and the polling booths that have been closed are generally those in minority neighbourhoods, in poor neighbourhoods. There have been voter purges. People turn up to vote and they say, you're not on the roll. And they say, yes, I am. They say, no, you're not. And they say, well, you can write a letter, you can appeal, but they've missed the vote. And these have been systematic voter purges. There have been attempts to curb voter registration drives, and in Tennessee last year, volunteers who tried to get out the vote for minority voters sometimes put in forms that were incomplete. They had blanks in them, and the state legislature passed legislation charging them that they would be charged with a criminal offence for having documents that were not accurate and presenting them as legal documents. Then you get huge ID issues that you turn up, you stand in line for hour after hour, you show your ID, and it turns out that you needed 2 pieces of ID or 3 pieces of ID or 1 more piece of ID than you actually had with you, whatever the number you brought with you. Then there's the whole issue of disenfranchisement of people who'd committed felonies. Again, in Florida, 1.4 million people of colour had convictions over time. You know, a teenage kid might have nicked a car, gone to reform school or gone to jail for a couple of years, and 40 years later that person is still unable to vote because of the conviction. So they passed a law. There was a citizen-initiated referendum to restore the rights, but then what has happened then? The state legislature passed legislation saying that yes, they had the right to vote, but they had to pay back the court fees, the expenses in the court for when they did their trial, the expenses that were incurred in their arrest. And in essence, this was another form of poll tax. And then, of course, there's been a whole range of intimidation of minority voters. A whole range of intimidations where people said, look, you know, if you register, you've got to give us all this information about your family and where you came from and all your relatives in the United States. And some of these might be illegals, or I mean, all sorts of things. And so people are kept off the roll. So you put that package of goods together, and you have a situation where voter turnout is low, votes are suppressed, and very often elections are stolen. And so this then leads into other issues about the responsiveness and the integrity of government. So I want to just spend a quick minute or two to just talk about the second point that I wanted to pick up from Lisa, and that was about less corruption. Countries that have compulsory voting generally are less corrupt. It's not just compulsory voting, but value integrity in the voting process. And the countries, the Northern European countries, New Zealand, they do very well. Australia, on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, it's interesting, Australia had always been in the top 10, coming around about 8 out of about 180. And in the last few years, it's fallen from about 8th to about 13th. Some people say this is a monumental crisis for Australia. Others say, well, it sort of levels out because what we've seen is a fair bit of activity about politicians who've broken laws. Eddie Obeid in New South Wales was a prime case of forcing the voter, the corruption perception index down. But what we've got is a situation that when we see a politician charged with some sort of corrupt offence, there is monumental community outrage. And the book very often gets thrown at them. And this is in contrast. This is in contrast to other countries where it becomes the norm. And the way to look at this is, where corruption is the norm, generally, voting integrity is not high. Where corruption is the exception, which it is in Australia, because we can all go about our daily lives without the fear of being shaken down by a public servant or a politician asking us for a bribe or whatever, we're in a different story. But electoral commissions are ranked very highly as integrity agencies in most countries where voting integrity is high, and in Australia where compulsory voting is the norm. So what we've got, yes, we do have issues with political donations. We do have issues with the transparency of donations. We do have issues with undue influence of politicians. We generally don't have issues with politicians getting bagfuls of cash to do stuff, though we did have a case in Queensland about a decade ago of a politician doing that. But what I want to finish with is just to say, look, we've got an integrity envelope. We've got an integrity envelope that starts with the sort of compulsory registration and compulsory voting. Then it goes through to robust governmental processes that happen during elections and after elections, and the bringing together of Parliament and the whole process of government. Then we've got an inclusive ideology saying that everybody can have a go and be part of it, and we have continual review and transparency, and people know where they stand in the process. Now, not everybody likes the outcome of every election, as Lisa says. Sometimes your side doesn't win, but generally, we take it and say, well, that's the way it goes. The process delivered the result that we've got, and we go on with it and we do the best we can. Thanks very much.
Thank you to Professor Lisa Hill and to Professor Adam Gravcar for that very passionate and informative presentation. We now have opportunity to field some questions. Both Adam and Lisa will be online to field those questions. So please send your questions through now. Thank you. Well, that brings us to a close for tonight's event. Thank you for submitting your questions. We've got quite a few questions coming through, and we have had some questions sent through us earlier tonight, so thank you. The first question tonight is compulsory voting in Australia for federal elections. So I'll throw this one to you, Lisa. Would it not be easier to vote electronically and calculate the preferences rather than paper voting and counting at the end of a very long day?
You're muted, Lisa.
In a way, it would be easier to vote online, but I don't think it would actually be in any way better. The one way in which it would be better, though, is as you surmise, Glenys, which is that counting would be faster. Definitely would be faster, but that's really, as far as I can see, the only benefit you would get, especially here. You might get a few outliers like shut-ins or people with disabilities or the young voting in slightly higher numbers with electronic voting. But the thing is, you might lose a few things as well. And one of the things I think we might lose is, first of all, elections in Australia are actually festive occasions. We all come together, we all share the democratic moment. It's quite nice, actually, and we're all there together. And so it's one of the few occasions for solidary democratic activity where we're just all there together and we're all voting together. So I find it quite festive with the sausage sizzle and all that. Secondly, I would worry about interference, even though that's not a huge worry. We have run electronic elections here in New South Wales and in Canberra without a lot of interference. But I keep thinking about that big census fiasco we had, and I would worry. And so it's really a question of what problem are we trying to solve? If it's a turnout problem, our turnout problem is not too bad, except among young people it's declining. We might help some people with infirmity or disability, that might help. But basically it wouldn't necessarily help. The other thing I would worry about, but this can be accounted for, but most voting systems don't account for this, but this can be built into the system, is that when you have an electronic system, electoral commissions are so focused on capturing as many formal votes as they can. They don't always allow for the informality of the vote. Now, it might sound mad that I think you should be allowed to vote informally if you want to, but I think in a compulsory voting system, if you're being compelled to vote, the least we could offer people that object to it, remember there's always 30% that object to it, we should allow them the possibility of casting a blank ballot or an informed vote, and also the possibility of writing comments, just like people are able to do on the blank ballot. A lot of people write, crude messages, but most people don't do that. Most people write a political message on their ballot. And so I'd want that opportunity to be there for people. So I think there's something to be gained, but more to be lost, to be honest, with electronic voting.
Next question is around, again, voting, and voting a solution for everything. So, for example, if we were to use the current pandemic and voting to download the COVID app, COVID Safe app, and if the majority voted yes, does that mean we have to force everyone to download the app?
Well, were you going to answer that, Adam?
I'll just start very quickly to say what this was really about is a debate about the philosophical basis of government. And that is government about citizen-initiated referenda? In other words, do citizens vote on every issue, or do we vote for representatives to make the decisions for us? And our pattern has been to vote for representatives. They group together, they come together, they have an agenda. And one of the difficulties, if you have a citizen-initiated vote for every issue, particularly a partisan issue, you get monumental distortions because everything gets reduced to a quick soundbite. You don't get the detailed consideration of policy. So it's a philosophical issue. But Lisa, you've probably got other thoughts. You've got something you can add to that.
Yes, I do have something to add to that. Well, first of all, you make the point that we live in a representative democracy because it's a mass society. We cannot be involved in every single decision. Where we see settings with citizens-initiated referenda, they are subject to a lot of distortions, particularly by moneyed interests, but that would be less of a problem here. But the job of government is to make decisions on our behalf because we're busy making a gazillion decisions every day in our own lives. So we're supposed to trust government, and when we've voted for them at election time, and we've all voted, the government is actually more trusted and more trustworthy. That is not to say that citizens shouldn't have some input between elections, but we don't need to vote on everything. But this might actually be something to vote on because it's a security and public health issue of great importance. So it's not a void question. It's actually a sensible one because it may be a question on which we should all be asked to vote, but in a way people already have voted. They voted they will download it, or they voted they won't download it, but they haven't quite voted on it in the way that the question means. But that might be a particularly good example where we might sometimes ask the people to vote, but you wouldn't want to be doing that all the time, not least because there's a thing called voter fatigue. Now, in Switzerland, they have referenda night and day on everything, and they have the federal system as well, and people there get sick and tired of being asked their opinions on things, and that depresses turnout. So they only have turnout in 30 to 40% range because people get sick of voting. So you don't want to wear citizens out. You've got to have just the right amount of voting for citizens to stay connected to and to have trust and faith in their voting system.
Right. Given, I guess, that it is compulsory, why is it that preferential voting is considered to be an advantage over, I guess, one person, one vote?
Well, I think that's first past the post, isn't it? No, it probably meant first past the post, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Because under both systems, you'd have one person, one vote. And Adam, you might have something to add to this, but I'll just explain it briefly. It is a vast improvement on one first past the post. And here's an example. Say you're in England and where they have first past the post, or America. In voluntary systems, it depresses the vote because there's a very good chance you won't get anything you want. Say there are 3 candidates running and 33% vote for one, 33% vote for another, 33% vote for another, or 34% vote, let's say, that means 66% of people don't get anything they even remotely like. So it's not a good system for maximising choice and satisfying voters and giving them some kind of representation. With preferential voting and also proportional voting, you can, let's say it's preferential voting, you might not like the second preference, but they're not bad, or the third. So it gives you the least hated person. But you might get your third preference, but at least you get something. Everyone can get something in a preferential system. Their third least most liked person, or their second most liked person, but they don't end up with nothing in their hand. This is why you get low turn. One of the big reasons why you get low turnout in first past the post systems. People just feel, what's the point of my going? There's no way I can get my candidate up. I'm wasting my time, and they literally are wasting their time. In a preferential system, you're never wasting your time, never, ever. There's going to be someone in there that you kind of like. You can't get your first preference, but you might get someone in there that you like. You get some degree of representation. So it's a vastly superior system, in my opinion.
Generally, yes, but if I can just add one little bit, people are mostly able to work out, as you say, their second or their third preference. But when you're down to your 45th preference, it becomes a bit of a farce. And we've seen some situations in Australia through the Senate system where people with negligible numbers of first votes have been elected to the Senate on a 30th or 40th preference vote, and people wouldn't be able to do that. And there has been an attempt to reform the voting system in that way to, cut off after about the 5th or the 6th or whatever preference. So yes, it's fine for a small number of preferences, but when you get into a lot, it becomes a bit of a farce.
Yes, true.
Another question that's come through: should prisoners have the right to vote if they are removed from society?
Yes.
Yeah, I've done some work on this. Prisoners are citizens and they are persons. That means they're bearers of rights. They don't stop being a human being, and they don't stop being a bearer of rights just because they've been removed from society. A person that's in hospital is removed from society, that has to live there, but they are still able and legally able to vote. Losing your right to vote should not be a collateral effect of having committed a crime. Losing your citizenship, the most important citizenship right. You've lost the right to perfect liberty, but of movement, but you haven't lost the right to be a member of the demos. And we know that a lot of judges, when they're sentencing, don't even know that loss of voting rights can be a collateral penalty. They're not even aware, and they might be more thoughtful about it if they knew. But there's no reason why a prisoner shouldn't vote. And in fact, if the purpose of incarceration is rehabilitation, not punishment, surely we would want to use voting as a rehabilitative tool. Now, this isn't just a surmise on my part. A good friend and colleague of mine, Victoria Shinneman, has done some studies on the restoration of voting rights to prisoners in the United States, where they systematically try and exclude prisoners from the votes, from voting rights. And when you reinstate those rights, incredible things happen with the behaviour of the prisoners. First of all, there's lower rates of recidivism, as surmised by me in previous work. It turns out people are less likely to commit a crime, and they report more pro-social attitudes. They report more law-abiding attitudes and friendlier attitudes to other human beings, and more trusting attitudes towards other human beings, and a less likelihood of infringing the rights of other human beings. So there are so many different reasons to reinstate the voting rights of prisoners. Don't get me started.
We're getting lots of questions. We are getting lots of questions come in, but we are running out of time. So there's probably time for probably 2 more questions. One question that's come through is around political donations. And the question there is, does the political donation and lobby system mean that the system I guess, is only there for the wealthy and for the well-organised?
This is a hard one because in a democratic society, people want people who think like they do to take the reins of government, and generally they support them. On the other hand, if the wealthy buy elections and buy the outcomes they want, that's a distortion of the democracy. So the way through it, we've got a reasonably sensible way of doing it by having caps on donations, but also we need to have more transparency. And one of the debates is about real-time transparency, rather than waiting for 12 months or more after the election to put in a return as to what sort of donations you had. As the donations come in, that could be an important thing. But what is important is whether a donation buys an election. In other words, when you give a donation, what do you want in return? Do you want a general ideology? And that seems a fairly legitimate thing in a democratic society. Or do you want a very specific policy that other people oppose? So buying elections is a terrible thing, and there are ways that this can be managed.
Okay, thank you. Final question for tonight, and it's around sort of the electoral cycles. And the question there is, how do we get long-term thinking in politics with such short-term electoral cycles?
Well, one of the things is about the vision and the coherence of policy processes. What do politicians listen to? And most political parties try to have a vision of the sort of society that they want. They have a vision, they have policies in process. Sure, stuff gets in the way. And looking right now at the COVID situation, looking at the way in which the budget isn't coming out the way that the Commonwealth government wanted it to come out, there are great disruptions, and the ideology behind a lot of the activities may not well be there. There's no simple answer. It's about holistic visions. It's about being able to portray a set of values that people will support you with, rather than always throwing a bit of candy out to the electorate. Lisa, do you have a comment on that?
No, I don't have anything to add to that. Thanks, Anna. Nick?
Great. Okay, well, thanks everyone. That brings us to a close for tonight's event. So I'd just like to thank our two presenters, Professor Adam Gravcar and Professor Lisa Hill, for that informative presentation. And thank you to everyone at home for tuning in via Zoom and via Facebook. We hope you will join us again next month. So take care, stay safe, and good night.
Bye.
Well, that brings us to a close for tonight's event. Again, I'd like to thank our two presenters, Professor Adam Gravcar and Professor Lisa Hill. And I'd like to thank you at home for participating in tonight's presentation. We hope you'll join us again next month. So please take care and stay safe. Good night.
Nick, if that's the worst thing that happened,